so what this story of Baby P was characterised by was this very dramatic form of othering. The most dramatic, as soon as you associate evil with anything or anyone in terms of our culture, and of course that has become identified with a whole class of people very readily. It has opened up the gates for a much more punitive, sanction-based welfare system. Not just this case, I would argue this case was part of that drive, not the cause of it. The reason Baby P took off as a story in the way it did was because it resonated with a lot of other things that were going on at the time. The blueprint for the welfare system as we know it now was already in place, was waiting to be operationalised. It reinforces this binary distinction between good, preferably middle class families, so good parents are increasingly identified with a sort of middle class norm, which even, by the way, middle class parents can't aspire to. We can't even meet the threshold for being good middle class parents anymore because it's being set so high. The state has to intervene even in middle class parenting now. And this bad parent. Class contempt and disgust and the struggle for respectability are very much at the centre of these processes. I would argue it's harder than ever before for many parents to feel confident they've achieved this status of respectability from which one can feel that you are projecting into the world an idea of being a good parent. Very hard. And there's lots of work going on in fields like education. Diane Ray's work on social class and education being very, she wrote an excellent book some years ago now called Class Work, about how parents related to teachers in relation to their children. It's really worth a read from a social work perspective because the levels of shame and feeling of inadequacy in those sorts of contexts in an education system get across very, very graphically how people are struggling with this idea of respectability. But very interesting that I think a story that runs alongside all of this, which probably is familiar to you, is a story which doesn't get referred to, which is another story which is about middle class parenting and social work. This was also there in the themes around the stories of Baby P. Let's be plain, if 1/10 part of the events that took place in Baby P's mother's house had happened in a middle class home, the child would have been snatched away in minutes by haughty social workers. They are always prone to imagine abuse among the respectable, even when it's not taking place. And this very much is this damned if you do, damned if you don't axis, which we are always sitting in. But it also pinpoints this impossible task we face really, of being being perceived at the very same time, both as impotent in the face of families that are considered to be very challenging, failing, bad parents, but also omnipotent at the same time. We are the people who will go in and snatch children out of the hands of parents that are doing a fantastic job, if only we could see it. And that really is the reason why these stories have such an appeal, because both stories are equally dramatic. Both stories have a victim, in this case the poor middle class parent who's wrongly suspected of being a terrible parent, and of course we are the folk devil. Social work is the folk devil in each case. The real scandal is not just that social workers too often fail to act where a child is being genuinely ill-treated, but that they are far too quick to seize children from responsible parents for wholly inadequate reasons. So I don't know this story based on any of the data that and I don't really know practitioners or social workers that do either. The point is, though, this does not matter. The reality, this is the power of narrative, it doesn't even matter that there's no such story in fact out there in the real world. What matters is this is the cultural narrative that everyone out there believes. And if you talk, as I do, to relatives and friends, so for example, I had a young guy I know whose son went to nursery and there was some problem with his son. Basically, it was a very minor issue, but the staff manager at the nursery wanted to talk to the parents about this thing. And he said he was terrified. This is a kind of middle-class civil servant, married to an accountant, da da da. They were absolutely terrified. And I said, well, what did you imagine might happen? He said, I thought they were going to call social services. And they were going to and he said, I thought they were going to come around and visit the house. And I thought, but then what did you think? He said, Well, then I thought, they could take the kids away. And it's like, yeah, but why would they do that? Well, he didn't say this, but this was what was in his fantasy about social workers. And it's very important that we kind of don't lose sight of that, because the middle class fantasy about who we are is partly what drives the system in the direction it goes, which is towards family where you can very quickly and easily see that they are not like us, in inverted commas. It drives the us-them binary thing for all services, which is that social workers must be diverted in all they do to people who are clearly other, them, who are clearly inadequate in some way. And how do we know who those families are? We know them through these, if you like, narrative shorthands. And if all of you that sit in case conferences and so on, this will be familiar, because when you talk to parents who've been through the system, that is what they say about how they experience the system, which is that it almost doesn't matter what they say or do. They have been identified as a certain kind of parent, and from then on the battle is to try to overturn that set of assumptions about themselves. So, so the story of child protection in recent years, or children and family services, is not only about othering the underclass, but it's about middle class anxieties about children and parenting that are constantly under the surface and rippling away. The focus on risk and fear for our children is ever more prevalent. So you've got people whose children really have very little to fear, actually, in terms of their life chances compared to the children that you all work with. Paradoxically, there's a massive fear on the part of those parents whose children are most likely to do well, to do best. Look, for example, at the heated debates about grammar schools. And there are those of us on the margin saying, well, hang on a minute, let's not worry about those kids that you're fighting for to get into grammar schools in Kent. Let's think about the kids who are not even going to be thinking about the 11th plus. Who's thinking of even about their education? Where are these children's education? But there's quite disproportionate focus. Children have also become, ever more than ever, the final fundamental of our identity. They are the big investment, the future. So although children are always about the future, they're about our sort of cultural future in very specific ways. And there is really, combined with that, and probably the corollary of it, is this context of economic collapse and a fear of falling among middle class parents. The idea that your children are not automatically going to own homes, going to go into professions, going to go to places they might want to go. And so a lot of fighting, if you will, in the middle class for the jockeying, if you like, for position, for children. And a growing divergence of parenting experience and reflection of inequality. So if you think, for example, about the clinics for pregnancy, I've got the postnatal, the other natal. Perinatal. Antenatal, that's right, yeah. I've got my Greek on that. So antenatal, where you can now have a thing for your fetus, I can't remember what it is, but it's some sort of thing you can have for your fetus. Not even, it goes beyond photograph. It's something incredibly tech, quite expensive to have. But it kind of helps you form that attachment. Compare that with women who won't even go to the initial appointments and don't see the point, don't want to kind of, that difference is ever greater and greater and greater. And the paranoia about social work I've always referred to, but I think that paranoia is definitely, it's different now from what it would have been some years ago. And I think that's important for us to bear in mind in terms of how social work is kind of understood, what we do. I think there is a big issue around the conversations that we need to have about parenting in general, in this country in particular, because of that perceived, if not real, schism between what people out there might think thresholds should be and what we, how we experience them in the actual work. So, to what extent do these kind of emotional politics bear down on practice? Well, we've already really witnessed that through your work, Jad, but how can they be challenged and changed? What can be done? And I guess one thing for me links again to the earlier work today, which was how do we get these other stories out there? And how do we invite a dialogue and a conversation about what it is we're doing, what we do, and why we do it, and how decisions are made, and so on. So I'll leave it at that. So, thanks.